JT Wister still have Locked On Utes. I want to go back and forth a bit here because so many people are now high on BYU. And if you're going to create a Locked On Big 12 or any Big 12 power rankings, you're putting the Cougars above the Utes, which is something that none of us ever expected to do over the course of the season. But by virtue of them being 5-0, BYU's earned some flowers. We'll get into the analytics of whether or not BYU would beat Utah because they look very good for BYU, oddly enough. But I want to know, just off the what you've seen, the eye test, would Utah confidently beat BYU, and especially in Rice-Eccles Stadium, where that game will be played?
Not confidently. I'll say that right off the bat. BYU, you guys proved me wrong already. I even said you'd lose to Baylor. I've been incredibly impressed with the Cougars and the ability they have to find ways to win. So a ton of credit to what Kalani, Sitake, and this BYU team has done, already surpassing all the expectations that have been set for them. I do. Drake, we'll talk about why. I'm excited to hear your analytics. I still feel confident in this Utah team in their matchup against BYU. BYU has proved they are one of the best teams in this conference. But just as every single team is the case with every single team in this conference, I have major questions about BYU still, and I'll illustrate why in a moment.
College Football Insiders. This guy is Stats O War on Twitter. And many of you have seen him because he does the Did We Get Beat That Bad graph every week that shows you whether or not you actually pounded the opposing team or got pounded yourself. And he does deep analytics of every possible matchup in college football. You can create your own. He has BYU. This is not himself, but rather the computer, the algorithm, the analytics. BYU a 74% chance to beat Utah. 28-20 being the final simulated score of that game. Reason being, Utah is defensively 55th EPA against the rush this season in the nation, 23rd against the pass. So the pass defense analytically has been much better than the rush defense. Then for BYU, their offense now is 27th in balance in the rushing game. They found footing there because of the use of different athletes and even freshmen that have stepped up. Now, one thing that I think bodes really well for Utah analytically is their third and fourth down success. Did you know, JT? Defensively, Utah is 10th in the nation, 28% allowed percentage on third and fourth down against opposing offenses. Third and fourth, Utah will shut you down. BYU offensively, 113th conversion percentage on those downs. That's not very good. But where the big discrepancy is while the Utah defense grades better than the BYU offense, the BYU defense grades way better than the Utah offense. That's where I think this matchup could get dicey in a couple weeks, especially if this Utah team doesn't have Cam Rising back or Brant Keithy's not 100%. I mean, Caleb Lohner has been good. You mentioned this earlier, yes, but he's not Brant Keithy. For BYU defensively, they're 15th in the country against the rush, 7th against the pass. And Utah has the 68th best rushing offense in America, the 85th best passing offense in America. I'm just worried. And the third and fourth down success, BYU 31st on defense, Utah 109th on offense. What I'm worried about is this turns into a defensive 13-10 game. And especially then, I don't have the confidence that Utah will win that game 9 out of 10 times, as I would have said in the preseason.
I think it's absolutely fair when you look at the way this offense has looked with Isaac Wilson at times.
Which it's me. I know. I get it. Everybody's like, oh, he's the BYU. Those are like numbers. I am reading you numbers from a graph that shows me how these two teams have graded all year long, and the Utah offense has just been like that.
And it's interesting, some of the numbers, right? Because I should have checked before. Mekhi Bernard going into last week was one of the top running backs in the nation. So I am surprised that Utah graded that low with rushing. And I do have confidence in Utah's run game. I felt like they got away from it in the second half because they fell behind and they put the game on Isaac's shoulders, which is where things got out of hand. But look, this is going to be a really good matchup right now. And this is where the Cam Rising factor could really tip the scales in Utah's favor if he's healthy. And I still find it hard to believe Utah's going to lose multiple games at Rice-Eccles Stadium, but I've already been wrong once on that before, so we'll see. Here's my thing with BYU. The offense has obviously looked better than Utah's, but as of late, I don't love how they haven't convincingly beat a team with their offensive performance. You might be saying, what do you mean by that? They blew out Kansas State. Well, the first 4 touchdowns they scored in that game, fumble recovery, short field off an interception, both times, then the punt return touchdown. That's not you can't win that way week after week. Well, then you might be saying, hey, JT, look at what we did against Baylor. Yes, you got off to a really hot start against Baylor in Waco. Impressive. You didn't put them away. You completely let them back in the game. After the first quarter, they outscored you. I give you guys credit for going up in the first quarter and BYU, you guys are really good, but you have not had that performance. I can still, if you want to talk about the best win between these two teams, I still think you're picking hairs a little bit. Kansas State is better than Oklahoma State. It's harder to win on the road in college football than it is at home. And I do feel like Kansas State, those self-inflicted wounds, if you played the Kansas State game 10 times again, you're only going to get that outcome so many times with those turnovers. The Utah one, it was a bad matchup for Oklahoma State. So I do feel like I just want to see more from BYU's offense, and consistently. They've already surpassed my expectations. They are capable of going into Rice-Eccles Stadium and beating Utah, but most of the things for Utah that I saw are very fixable and correctable. And this game also, I turn back to this. The veterans that Utah has, I still think is what's going to lead to them. Honestly, I mean, I'll just say it. I still think this team is going to end up rising to the top of this conference. Even though they've looked shaky, every team pretty much has. BYU and Iowa State will soon be in that camp with a loss. I have a hard time believing we're going to see a team go undefeated. I still think Utah will find a way to pull it out against BYU.
JT, in 10 quarters with Isaac Wilson at quarterback, Utah has scored 32 points. Mm-hmm. That's not that's not great. And with Cam Rising at quarterback in the Southern Utah game and the Baylor game, the offense is obviously much different. If Isaac Wilson is the starting quarterback against BYU, is that a complete detriment? I mean, how does that kid, when Avery Johnson couldn't do it and Sawyer Robertson for 3 quarters couldn't do it, and I would say those two quarterbacks are in different categories just entirely. And how do we know that Isaac Wilson could lead Utah to victory against BYU? And before you're a Utah fan, it's like, well, Cam will be back that week. We don't ever know that.
BYU would absolutely be favored in the game if Isaac Wilson had to start for Utah. But I'll also add this, which is something that Drake, you have also alluded to. We have seen Isaac Wilson grow throughout the season. Yes, the Arizona game wasn't great, but what happened at the start of that game? They got into the red zone and failed to execute. I do feel like the fact that Utah's moving the ball was obviously very encouraging. Didn't have an ideal second half, but we've still seen enough of the plays, the moments against Oklahoma State, the continued practice reps. This is a true freshman who is growing and getting better. And I do think this Utah defense, they got some injured players, Karene Reed, Connor O'Toole, a couple of the best players in the Big 12 at their respective positions. I believe they're going to come back here in the near future. That's always a risky thing to say, but the fact that it is at home, Rice-Eccles Stadium is going to be ruckus. Utah is still capable of beating BYU. Once again, BYU has questions just like Utah. So BYU would deserve to be favored, but I think Utah, because it's at home, I still would like them in this matchup.
Yeah, the BYU offense can turn it on for 2 quarters or turn it on for a quarter in a game and then have to lean on their defense and Jay Hill to shut the door. And that's not always a great thing. That middle 8 against Kansas State is a great example of where BYU, even offensively, never really caught on, but the defense led you to victory. JT, really quickly before we get to like the future of college football, strength and conditioning staff, nutrition team. I mean, you've worked inside the athletic department. At some point, there have been so many injuries for Utah. We've got to ask the question, how are we training? What's going on in the offseason? It's not a fluke. At some point, it's not a fluke.
Well, I will say, I called Cam injury prone earlier. I can't blame his most recent injury on the training staff, right? I mean, thrown into a Gatorade cart, cut his hand. Well, if anything, we'll blame it on the training staff for having the Gatorade that close. That's where it's frustrating, obviously. But, injuries are a part of college football. It's an incredibly physical game. I think that there are some things internally that I do believe Utah should take a look at for why this is happening. Yeah. But I believe this is part of, let's take BYU, Drake, or just give me a random team in the Big 12. Is there any team in the Big 12 that hasn't had a massive injury yet?
Everybody's dealt with at least one pretty good injury, but I want to date this back to last year too. When it's become this consistent, I think at some point you question, hey, what does the offseason look like?
They should internally take a look at it. I don't think that's the biggest problem, but they should internally review and make sure they are doing everything correctly. Because you're right, it is a concerning trend.
I wonder. It makes me. I don't know if it's strength and conditioning, nutrition, what it is, but at some point,
they might practice too hard.
Wow, we've got to adjust something. Coming up, are we seeing the end of college football as we know it? Maybe, but we're all going to have to adjust. This is Locked On Big 12 and Locked On U. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is where I go. FanDuel's where I go to say, man, Utah is a 13-point favorite against BYU this week, and I'm not sure. Their defense has been really good, but the offense is just okay. Well, BYU, they're a 14-point favorite against BYU, and by transitive property, that means that BYU be better than Utah. We can't have that, right? Come on. BYU being the bye week, by the way. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. It is America's #1 sports book. So you go bet on Utah -13 against BYU this week. So when you get a hard hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and even more. And you get $200 in bonus bets. That's right, $200 in bonus bets when you bet $5, win or lose. That's FanDuel.com. Go to FanDuel.com. -13 against BYU is not going to exist. If you're already Googling that for Utah or BYU, you're going to be very sorely disappointed. But FanDuel.com is America's #1 sportsbook and your place to go.